if we don't have any questions more, then I would like again to ask Mr. Riche, because he's, I think, online, but still.
Yes, I'm in line. Yes.
Okay. Great. Great. Then we are ready to listen to your presentation.
Okay, so I'm very sorry to leave because I had just a problem of COVID inside my family, and I had to leave the meeting. So now it's okay. So I would like to thank the organizer for their kind invitation to participate to this conference. I'm very happy to meet with all colleagues, friends, and I'm very happy also to have the opportunity to discuss about the problem of integration, enlargement, and growth in this part of Europe. And in the context of the COVID and so on. So my presentation will deal mostly with the so-called presence of China in this area. And I will, show the problem of how Chinese companies are entering this part of Europe, what they are doing in this area, and what can be the outcome of their presence in this area. So I have to find my presentation, which is on my desk. Sorry, give me 1 minute. And okay, so XR presentation. Okay, so 1 minute. Where is it? Well, I don't.
Okay.
Okay, what?
Yeah.
1 minute. No program. 1 minute. No. Ah. Okay, so the topic, as mentioned, is the fact that China, with 7 members of Eastern Europe plus Greece, has created the new format, the 17+1 format, and in fact, which has more or less bilateral relations with various countries of the region. And the problem concerning China, also for Europe, is the following question. Does China has in mind one Europe or different Europes? And does China has, let's say, a European strategy or different strategies if we integrate this part of Eastern Europe? Another question which is very important today is how can we assess the role and the importance of China in these regions? And I'm saying much ado about nothing, because what is the reality of this Chinese presence, which in the same time is weak, which produce a very strong asymmetries, and for several countries is below expectation in terms of investment, in terms of cooperation, in terms of access to the Chinese markets. And my idea is that, in fact, we are more or less in presence of a kind of archipelago of Chinese companies which are investing or which are working in this area instead of leverage. So it means we can see a lot of, let's say, project in several countries like Montenegro, like Bosnia, Herzegovina, and so on, with the exception maybe of Serbia, which is maybe a case apart. And also what is important today to consider is the fact that we are in a new area with COVID, because if we take the growth of China, at the world stage, we had a kind of China G2, for instance, which specific relation with the US. Then we had the G20 after the crisis, and now maybe we are going towards a kind of G3, for instance, with on the one hand, the US and China. So we have to consider this presence of Chinese in this area, of Chinese companies in this area, in the framework of this, let's say, global changes which has occurred recently. Okay, so if we look at the 70+1 format, it's sections of the Silk Road, and which encompass a variety of countries in Eastern and Southern Europe, 11 new EU members, of which 5 are in the Eurozone, 5 are in the process of accession. If we look at the Western Balkans, 12 are NATO members, and Kosovo, of course, is excluded. And those countries are in common or are different in terms of, let's say, past economic history. Some were integrated in the former socialist Soviet bloc, and other were independent socialism, if you take in consideration the former Yugoslavia, and one was an Arctic country. And those countries, as have been already discussed this morning, are passed very quickly and with some difficulties from socialism to the market. And they are all became more or less dependent capitalism, more or less dependent capitalist in terms of organization, but also in terms of dependencies from, let's say, Western Europe. 70% of trade and FDI are done with the EU. And also they are constrained or following the European regulation concerning institutions, market, international relations, and even those who are becoming or who are attending to become further member. And the question is, what is this market for Chinese companies? Is it a regional markets, homogeneous or not, or fragmented, mostly small, and let's say very little markets for China. And the specificity which has just been discussed is that Western Balkans, where we can find some important undertaking by China, are economic reconstructions and in the process of integration into the EU. And we have discussed, but I don't think that it's very important, the further role of Italy, which is not, let's say, which will not happen. But we can see also some notable absentees like Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. Okay, so we have the different figures, and what is important is the difference in size, of course, in GDP per head, as it has been discussed. And also the fact that all these countries are less developed among the EU member, new member, the E8, as we can see here in this table. And of course, the presence of China has raised some expectations from leaders in the area. For instance, I quote Milos Zeman, the Czech president, who said, the Czech Republic has an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Mr. Tsipras in Greece, advocating Greece could be served as China's gateway into Europe. Mr. Orban in Hungary, who said if the US cannot provide financial support, we return to China, and even the Serbian leader who speak about China as an internal steel friendship of Serbia. Okay, so there are very strong expectations. And in fact, if we look at the story of the presence of China, well, I mean, recent history, I don't speak about when they were still socialist countries. So China is creating more or less multilateral bilateralism with these 7 countries. The format has been created in 2012, just 1 year before OBOR. And the problem is what is the use of these, let's say, institutions on the one hand, if on the other hand, we consider that bilateralism is the best channel through which China is operating in these countries. Other interesting issues is the fact that most, among those countries, we can find different kind of, let's say, countries concerning their, let's say, their relations towards some, let's say, basic commitments. Some are illiberal democracies, and at what stage Hungary and Poland have thought that maybe this gate could bring some advantages and let's say increase the market, and other parties and other countries are, as we said, as a very famous former Yugoslav economist said, are multi-party kleptocracies. So it means that dealing with those countries can, let's say, be interesting for China. But all those, as John mentioned, all those countries have become dependent on capitalism, and for some of them, it's a way to lose the grip of the receivers by favoring cooperation with China, for instance, fighting against the Brussels bureaucracy and so on. And if you look at the main activities of Chinese companies in the area, they are concentrating on investment, trade, of course, and also service provisions, building infrastructure. So it's very important because if we look at the data, those data may be misleading because, in fact, they are not investment as we think, but let's say production of infrastructure and services, which means that once they are realized, China won't, Chinese companies won't be anymore in the country. And in some countries, we can see some soft power with the, let's say, creation of cultural institutes, scholarships, and so on, and even construction, building up a new university branch of Fudan University from Shanghai in Budapest, of course, after the departure of the CUE. So China, how China does enter into this area through, let's say, setting up specific funds, and once through the so-called political banks, Chinese political banks, those banks which, let's say, provide credits without, with no, what we call no string attached. So it means low conditionalities, low interest rates, which can be variable depending on the size of the deal, and of course with extended repayment terms and faster access to capital disbursements, which create some advantage for Chinese companies if we consider by the long delay, for instance, for those countries when they are applying for, let's say, European funds. Of course, one aspect which is very important to consider is the strong opacity of memorandum of understanding, which are signed between China and those countries. We have a very good example with the agreement which has been signed between China and Hungary for constructing a train track in Hungary. The Hungarian government doesn't dare even now to produce the content of this deal. Okay, so the threats of one of the threats through this finance strategy is that already some countries are highly indebted, and maybe the problem will, if we consider Montenegro and Bosnia, and the problem is how those countries, if they are not able to reimburse, what could be the role, how China could, let's say, take eventually control of those investments. So the second point which I have mentioned is the fact that Chinese presence can be divided between service provisions. I have mentioned construction of infrastructure, but with direct investments and exchanges. If we look at infrastructures, as we know, they are constructing roads, ports, rail lines, thermal power stations, and if we look at EVI, they are quite fundamentally, they are still very limited. And because already what was to be sold has been sold, and there are very few greenfield investment, but not only in this part of Europe. One of the main critics which are made concerning FDI, Chinese FDI in Europe in general, is that the role of greenfield are very limited, and which is maybe the strong critics against China. And maybe we can consider that through investments, through this presence, China is trying to construct the regional value chains For instance, if you take electric batteries in the Balkans, in Bulgaria, in Serbia, but also in Croatia, but they are located in not promising markets. Of course, they are in low-cost products, and we have in mind the failures of the joint ventures in Bulgaria between Great Wall Company, Chinese companies, and the local makers in Bulgaria. One characteristic of the Chinese presence is that the operators mostly are Chinese and state-owned enterprises, but also Chinese labor, and let's say not only in infrastructure, building bridges in Serbia and so on, but even, for instance, in a tar factory which is going to be constructed in Serbia will be served by Chinese manpower. So the questions which is raised by some specialists is that certain project, their design, their utility, and the different construction are discussed, and there are, let's say, some discussion concerning the utilities of this high-speed train between the Serbia and Hungary, because lack of population, well, the fact that this investment maybe will have a very slow rentabilities. So, and last problem is the fact that China has to do an arbitration between and prioritization in the global strategy concerning Europe, because we know that China is going to the heart of Europe, and we have the east, the south. The heart, it's now China is seen as a strategic rival. In Northeast Europe, there are more difficult markets, adjustment already made through integration, and the Southeast, it's a less bureaucratic constraint from Brussels, and also there are more needs, for instance, on infrastructure. It's sure that China is taking the role and the place that the EU has not taken, and during the last decades. So now if we turn to the expectation of recipient countries, of course, for those countries, market search, export, and towards Chinese market, and also waiting for greenfield investments, which are creating jobs. And of course, as I mentioned already, we see that it's more difficult in the Visegrad 4 countries, and also some countries are more or less constrained by their value and commitments among the new member states. If we consider, for instance, Baltic states, they stick strongly to the European regulation, but it's not the case, for instance, of countries like Hungary and others. So we have to mention also the susceptibility of large countries. If we consider Poland, for instance, to end up with small countries, especially in the south. And of course, the main importance for China and for receiving countries is to be seen in the south of Europe, where there are many needs in terms of upgrading infrastructure. And of course, for let's say leaders who are receiving Chinese help, it's a way to stay in power while avoiding the constraints which are imposed by the EU. So it has been discussed, the famous strategy of stabilocracy. It means, you know, you stabilize yourself, but maybe you won't become a member of the EU. And what is interesting to mention, I won't have time to discuss that, is a real US pressure in some countries. For instance, if you take the case of the nuclear plant, which has been to be renewed in Romania or in other countries, they have been abandoned on the future, on the pressure of, let's say, of the US. Okay, so now what is interesting, in fact, if we look at investments, we have a very small part of, let's say, southern investment, and even in the Merrick table here, Southern Europe integrate also countries like Spain, Greece, and so on, but we see it's a very, very low. In fact, the real figures could be 3% of total investment of China in the region. But what is interesting is the shifting towards the south. And in fact, we see that the countries like Serbia, Slovenia, and so on are receiving more investments. In general, I don't have in mind the fact that inside investment, we have to integrate this idea of infrastructure, but we have a shift towards the south. So, and here we have good, we see, for instance, that most of infrastructure building are going to the south, and more share of investments, FDI, have to be seen in the south, classical, so-called classical FDI. Okay, so to go very quickly, I would say that now if we turn to Serbia, Serbia is quite interesting as a case, and it has been, how to say, considered as a Trojan horse of China. But we have to keep in mind that it's a more or less a free election in the region. And we have to keep in mind that Serbia has an open policy and which, let's say, rely on 4 pillars. So it means cooperation with the EU, with the US, EU in French, sorry, Russia in energy, military equipment, China, infrastructure, FDI, and so on. We have a specificity of the regime, let's say, the so-called kleptocracy and illiberalism at work with Mr. Vučić now. And it's a way also of, let's say, more or less blackmail vis-a-vis Europe to avoid bearing the cost of economic and political adjustment. So it means it's a way, for instance, to avoid to recognize Kosovo that Serbia should recognize if Serbia wants to receive funding, total funding from the EU. And also maybe the fact that Serbia is realizing that there will be no EU membership for a long time. So more or less, as specialists used to say, Serbia is locked in a mirage of democracy and Europeanization, which maybe will not occur soon. So if we conclude, we could say that I said much ado about nothing, because if we look at as an institution tool, the format 17+1 is more or less a fig leaf. It's petite ville, as we said in French. And if we look at the presence of Chinese investment, it's more or less an archipelago, and the search for economic and political leverage effect. So it means we have to consider a limited way of trade of FDI. Some countries up to now have been disappointed if we take the Czech, Poland, Baltics, because achievement are below expectations, long delay, and very small investment, notably in terms of, let's say, greenfield investment. There is a problem of coherence of strategy of the project. So it means that how those projects fit with local development. There is also the problem of visibility of some projects. So some projects are vagueness of, for instance, if we take the China-Europe Land Sea Express line, so so-called, in which we find the so-called Budapest-Belgrade TGV line. So it means it's a kind of, China wants to create a T. It means horizontally a line coming from Belarus to Germany, and a vertical line, this vertical line, the China-Europe Land Sea Express line, coming from Paris, from Paris to Budapest, and then Poland. So it means it's very interesting to see that it's a strong project, but in fact, it doesn't work because there is no train lines constructed in Greece. In Macedonia, it has been more or less stopped because of corruption. In in Hungary, it has been a very long process to agree because the EU has complained that the, let's say, the contract was not in line with the EU regulation and so on. So it's very important to see that we have, let's say, a flag investment, but in fact, in reality, China construct more ports, construct more motorways, and so on, besides this, let's say, structural investment, which is the central part of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. So the problem I've mentioned also is opacity, and I mentioned the case of Hungary, and also the risk of creating overcapacity in condemned sectors that do respect the environmental rules. For instance, when China is constructing or helping to modernize thermal plants in Bosnia, it means that Bosnia-Herzegovina in a few years will be a main supplier of electricity, thermal electricity in the area, much over that they need, their own need, and without respecting, let's say, the green plant and the green environment issue, which are they should respect. So another point is that what has changed and what could be the impact on the format in Eastern Europe is the fact that China is now considered by the EU more or less a strategic rival. So the concept has to be discussed, but it means that instead of cooperation, open cooperation, the EU is looking Chinese presence in Europe with a new eyes. It doesn't mean that it's constantly centered on this part of Europe, the Balkan countries and Eastern Europe, but it means that there is a new approach by the EU considering the presence of China and how the EU has filtered in some investment, protecting some, let's say, sensible sectors and so on. The other point is that, as I mentioned, China has abandoned several projects under the pressure of the US, for instance, renovation, extension of nuclear power plant. We have now the case of G5 technology. And also we have this arbitration, as mentioned, with Chinese of Chinese interests. What are the most important interests of China? To be present in the EU 14 or either in the EU 11. So it means what will be the most important in the coming year for China and how they could reconsider their strategy concerning investment and cooperation. And there is another issue which is very important, is the what will be the multilateralism after the US elections. So do we see a splitting globalization? Do we consider Europe as a pole of globalization and receiving Central and Southern Europe? So it means, for instance, we have discussed about the relative delocalization of European investment in China towards Europe. And Mr. Bonnell, I think the High Commissioner, EU Commissioner, has mentioned the fact that Eastern Europe could become a recipient of investment which, let's say, up to now, were realized in China and so on. So there is a new understanding of, let's say, the relation between China and Europe, and which might have some interest and consider the presence of China in this part of Europe. So thank you very much. And again, very sorry to have missed my time when I was expected to present my paper. Thank you.
Mr. Рише. We have a question from Dr. Nikolic, but the question is about the Serbia. He left this question in the chat before you explained the case of China, Chinese investment and Chinese economic policy in Serbia. I would like to ask Mr. Nikolic, did Dr. Рише answered your question about the prospects of Serbia to become a member of the European Union or not?
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.